The desert west of Buckeye, Arizona, keeps its secrets the way it keeps everything else, quietly, patiently, under a sun that erases footprints by noon. And on the morning of July 19, 2021, a rancher moving through that emptiness in search of stray cattle found something the desert had not managed to hide. A 2017 Jeep Renegade, blue-gray, rolled onto its passenger side at the bottom of a ravine. The airbags had deployed. The front end was crushed. The driver's side window was shattered. A piece of the roof was gone, and the vehicle was still in drive. Scattered around it, roughly 3 feet from the wreck, was a life reduced to its pieces. A pair of jeans. 2 socks turned inside out. 2 brown work boots. A faded orange safety vest with the logo of an engineering company stitched onto it. A t-shirt. Inside the Jeep sat the things a person carries when they intend to come home. A cell phone, a wallet, a set of keys. Everything was there. Everything except the young man who owned it. His name was Daniel Robinson. He was 24 years old, a geologist, and he had last been seen alive nearly a month earlier, driving this exact Jeep away from a well site just a few miles from where it now lay. In the weeks between that morning and this one, more than 70 square miles of Sonoran Desert had been searched by helicopters, drones, cadaver dogs, and volunteers on foot. And still, when the rancher stood over that ravine and looked down at the clothes laid out beside the crumpled metal, the central question of this case was already fully formed, and it has never once loosened its grip. The Jeep sat crashed in the Arizona desert for weeks. But where was Daniel Robinson? Before we walk this trail any further, I want to know where you're joining me from tonight. Drop your city in the comments below. This case reaches across the country, from a desert in Arizona to a family in South Carolina, and someone watching right now might live near that stretch of Sun Valley Parkway. Someone might have driven past that desert. That person might know something they don't even realize matters yet. To understand what was lost out there, you have to understand who Daniel Robinson was before the desert swallowed his trail, because he was never just a missing person report or a crashed Jeep. He was somebody's son, somebody's brother, and by every account of the people who knew him, he was hard to forget. Daniel Cornelius Robinson was born on January 14, 1997, in Columbia, South Carolina. He came into a large, close-knit family. His father, David Robinson II, his mother, Melissa, an older brother, twin sisters, and a younger sister. His siblings would later say that they had helped him make peace early in life, with a fact that never once slowed him down. Daniel had been born without his lower right arm. His right hand and part of his forearm had never fully developed in the womb. For a lot of children, that might have been a wall. For Daniel, according to everyone who watched him grow up, it was barely a footnote. He was active in athletics. He was, in his father's words, bold, the kind of person who could walk into a room and make friends before he'd found a seat. David described a son who was naturally inquisitive, who challenged everything around him, who went after whatever he wanted. Daniel would go after whatever he wants, his father said, very adventurous and loved to be a part of everything. He attended A.C. Flora High School in Forest Acres, South Carolina, and then went on to the College of Charleston, where he found the subject that would define him: geology, rocks and water and the slow architecture of the earth. His father would later remember phone calls where Daniel wanted him to see the rock formations, wanted to describe what he was learning, wanted to share the plain wonder of the ground beneath everyone's feet. It suited him. A restless, curious mind had found a field that rewarded exactly that. In 2019, Daniel graduated and was hired as a staff hydrogeologist with Matrix New World Engineering. The job took him to Arizona, to the Phoenix metro area, and it was, as his father put it, the perfect job for him. It sent him out to remote desert sites across the West Valley, often traveling long distances alone, working in extreme heat, studying the water beneath one of the harshest landscapes in the country. For a young man with an innate passion for adventure and a love of the outdoors, it was almost too fitting. He started learning to hike. He fell for the desert's strange beauty, and through all of it, no matter the distance between his apartment in Tempe and his family back in South Carolina, Daniel stayed in touch. This is one of the details that people who knew him returned to again and again, because it matters so much to what came later. Daniel and his father spoke constantly, long conversations, 1 to 2 hours at a stretch. He was close with his mother, his siblings, everyone. He checked in, he shared his plans. When he traveled, and he traveled often, his family always knew. Just days before he vanished, Daniel had been making plans that pointed straight at a future. He was arranging a hiking trip with his sister, who was going to visit him in Arizona. He and his father had talked about David flying out in July to finally see Daniel's new Jeep in person. There were birthdays ahead. There were holidays ahead. There was, in every ordinary way a life carries momentum, a young man moving forward. Now that you know who Daniel Robinson was, a real person, a scientist, a brother, a son who called his father just to describe the shape of a rock, does he remind you of someone in your own life? Someone curious? Someone adventurous? Someone who checks in? Tell me about them in the comments. Keeping Daniel's memory alive, keeping his name in the light, is part of why this channel exists. June 23, 2021, began as an ordinary workday. Daniel had more than one job site to cover, and by mid-morning he had made his way out to a remote well site in the desert near the intersection of Sun Valley Parkway and Cactus Road, in the far reaches of Buckeye. This was rugged, isolated country, rocky outcrops, sparse brush, dirt roads that could challenge anyone unfamiliar with them, the nearest town miles away in any direction. That morning, Daniel was working alongside a man he had never met before, a pump technician from another company, identified in police documents as Kenneth. Kenneth would become the last known person to see Daniel Robinson alive, and his account is the hinge on which the entire timeline turns. According to Kenneth, the two met on the shoulder of the roadway, and Daniel followed him to the assigned well site. They arrived around 9 in the morning, and then, over the span of just 15 minutes or so, Kenneth watched Daniel behave in a way that stayed with him. Daniel, he said, stared off into the distance. He talked about things unrelated to the work in front of them. At one point he asked Kenneth, a stranger he'd known for minutes, whether he wanted to go home, whether he wanted to go back to Phoenix to rest. According to the police report, Daniel was saying things that did not seem to make sense. Kenneth would later tell a reporter that Daniel had a strange, distant look. He was just looking off into the desert, he said. He had a very, very distant look in his eyes. His first instinct, he admitted, was that it might be drugs, but he noticed Daniel's pupils were not dilated. And here the account carries an important nuance, one that would be argued over for years to come. In the police report itself, Kenneth ultimately stated that he saw no behavior or statements suggesting Daniel was hallucinating, was incoherent, or was having some kind of mental health crisis. Strange, yes. Distant, yes. But not, in Kenneth's telling to police, someone visibly in the middle of an emergency. Then Daniel checked a weather app to see whether it was going to rain. He got into his blue-gray Jeep Renegade. He waved, and he drove off into the desert. There was a moment, small and now unbearably significant, at a fork in that dirt road. To the left lay the route back toward Phoenix. To the right lay the deeper desert, terrain stretching west and south into nothing. Kenneth would say he followed Daniel's tire tracks in the rain-dampened dirt and saw that Daniel had turned right, away from the road home, and farther into the wilderness. Kenneth called his own coworkers to tell them what had happened, assuming Daniel simply wasn't feeling well and would call in sick. No one ever heard from Daniel again. Cell phone records would later place his phone at the eventual crash site around 10:05 that morning, with the pinging stopping at roughly 10:30. It appeared he made no calls and sent no texts after leaving the site. His phone from that point went silent, either powered off or beyond the reach of any tower in that empty country. That evening, when Daniel didn't respond to the ordinary rhythm of family contact, when the calls and texts went unanswered, alarms set in fast. His father, informed of the situation, reported him missing to the Buckeye Police Department. And then David Robinson did what a certain kind of father does. He got in a vehicle and drove roughly 2,000 miles from South Carolina to Arizona to look for his son himself. What he found when he arrived was the beginning of a fight that has not ended to this day. The initial investigation is where this case first began to fracture, and where much of the family's anguish would ultimately take root. The morning after the report, Buckeye Police launched a ground search near the job site, and the Tempe Police Department was dispatched to Daniel's apartment. But according to the timeline later made public, the officers who went to the apartment on June 24th did not go inside. Police would not actually enter Daniel's home until July 7th, nearly 2 weeks after he was reported missing. Civil Air Patrol, the volunteer force that conducts aerial searches, was not contacted until that same date, July 7th. To a family watching the clock in a desert where a person could die of exposure in a matter of hours, those 2 weeks felt like an eternity slipping away. "Time is of the essence," David told a reporter early on, "and if you don't move fast enough, you may not ever find the person." Buckeye Police attempted to ping Daniel's phone, but got nothing usable. The phone was off or out of range. They tried to pull GPS data from the Jeep's onboard Uconnect system remotely and found none available. They entered him into the National Missing Persons Database, which would flag his name or vehicle anywhere in the country. They contacted friends, family, co-workers. They checked area hospitals, and they began to build a picture of Daniel's final days that would come to complicate everything. Because in the days before June 23rd, according to the police report, more than one person had noticed Daniel behaving unlike himself. There was the account of a friend who said, "In the days prior, something's up with Daniel. Something's not right. I need to talk to him." There was mention of Daniel abruptly cutting off hair he had been trying to grow out. There was a conversation about miracles, about whether the friend believed in them. Striking, the friend said, because Daniel had never really expressed religious views before, and there was something else, something that would generate headlines and theories for years. In early June, while working a side job delivering food, Daniel had met a woman during a delivery on June 12th. She had welcomed him into her home that day, with a friend present. But in the days that followed, according to the police report, Daniel began showing up at her home unannounced, repeatedly, even after she asked him to stop. She grew deeply uncomfortable and eventually asked him not to come back, watching him arrive again through a home security camera. Daniel, meanwhile, had told family members that he was in love with her. Investigators would later report that his behavior seemed to shift after that connection ended. And there were the search terms. When detectives eventually processed Daniel's electronic devices, they disclosed a handful of Google searches from the weeks before his disappearance that were, at minimum, unsettling out of context. "Love changed me. Delete Instagram account. Shooting Tempe. Explosion. I'm okay to do things I hate." To some investigators, these fragments sketched a young man in crisis. But his father pushed back, hard and immediately. He had spoken to Daniel 2 days before he vanished, he said, and they'd had a completely normal conversation. "None of those search terms," David said, "match up to anything that I had heard from Daniel." The family's position was consistent. Whatever unusual behavior others described, by the time Daniel went missing, he was back to himself. Then, on July 19th, the rancher found the Jeep, and the case cracked wide open into the mystery it remains. The vehicle was overturned in a ravine less than 4 miles from where Daniel was last seen, in terrain so rough that police said it simply could not be spotted from the air. The Jeep had front-end impact damage. The driver's window was smashed, a piece of the roof was missing, and it was still in drive. Initial evidence suggested that whoever had been behind the wheel was wearing a seatbelt at the moment of the crash, and laid out on the desert floor beside it were Daniel's clothes: jeans, boots, socks turned inside out, that orange matrix vest, with his phone, wallet, and keys inside the wreck. Crucially, there was no blood, no body, no obvious sign of injury severe enough to explain what had happened. Investigators launched an extensive ground search around the vehicle: search and rescue dogs, a Department of Public Safety helicopter, the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office. Over the course of the broader investigation, they would search more than 70 square miles using UTVs, drones, cadaver dogs, helicopters, and the Civil Air Patrol. They found nothing that led to Daniel, and Buckeye Police reached a conclusion that would define, and, to the family, damage, everything that followed. Based on the condition of the Jeep and the presence of his belongings, they announced that they did not suspect foul play. For David Robinson, that conclusion wasn't an answer. It was the moment the ground gave way. This is where the trail began to go cold, and where the disagreements over how it was handled hardened into something permanent. Because the deeper anyone looked at that crash scene, the less it seemed to explain. The area around the Jeep had experienced significant rainfall before the vehicle was found, and investigators acknowledged that any potential evidence could have been washed away. Nearly a month had passed between Daniel's disappearance and the discovery of his car, a month in the open desert during monsoon season, in a landscape that dismantles the dead with brutal efficiency. Whatever the scene had once been able to tell them, time and weather had been erasing it the entire while. But it was the rancher's own account that introduced the first genuinely strange note. The man who found the Jeep told police he had been in that same area on July 17th, just 2 days earlier, searching for his cattle, and that the Jeep had not been there. When he returned on the 19th, it was. He would also point out something grimly practical. If a body had been anywhere near that ravine, he believed he would have known, because his cattle would have swarmed to it. That single observation gnawed at the family's mind. If the Jeep hadn't been sitting in that ravine since June 23rd, if it appeared only in mid-July, then where had it been, and who had put it there? The forensic picture only deepened the unease. When the family gained access to Daniel's apartment in Tempe, alongside a private investigator, they found the common areas relatively clean, but the bedroom disturbed, messy in a way that struck the investigator less like an untidy young man and more like, in his words, somebody digging and looking for something. The family pressed Tempe police to forensically process everything Daniel owned, from his gaming system to his personal computers. And when those results came back, they carried a chill. Someone had accessed Daniel's computer after he'd gone missing, going through his files and search history. Investigators noted the possibility that this could have been law enforcement or opportunistic strangers who learned he was missing, but it could not be explained away, and it could not be confirmed as Daniel's own doing. Layer onto that the institutional friction, the 2-week delay before anyone entered the apartment, the delayed call to Civil Air Patrol, a co-worker's statement about the morning of the disappearance that the family said differed from what the first responding officer had described. David's insistence that he'd been given misleading impressions about the level of outside help involved. The family came to believe the department had been slow to act and quick to close the door on foul play, treating the case, from the start, as a young man who had simply wandered off, rather than as a possible crime. Buckeye Police, for their part, never wavered from their core position. There was no evidence of foul play. But they were also emphatic that this did not make Daniel's case any less important, and that detectives continued to investigate every tip and every lead. The department declined interview requests but repeatedly stated its commitment to finding him, and so the trail sat there, a crashed Jeep, a pile of clothes, a silent phone, a disturbed bedroom, a rancher who swore the timeline was wrong, and a father who had driven across the country and refused to leave. Everything and nothing. Enough anomalies to fuel a dozen theories, and not enough hard evidence to prove a single one. You've now seen everything the investigators had to work with, and exactly where they hit the wall. The Jeep that may or may not have appeared overnight. The 11-mile question. The clothes on the desert floor. The bedroom that looked searched. Before I walk you through the leading theories, I want your read first. What do you think happened to Daniel Robinson out there? Drop your theory in the comments, and be specific, because the people in these threads catch details the rest of us miss. There are broadly 3 theories that have been argued over this case, and it's worth stating plainly. None has been proven. Law enforcement has not endorsed one over the others as fact, and each has evidence that both supports and undercuts it. These are theories, nothing more and nothing less. The first is the theory that Daniel experienced some kind of medical or mental health episode, drove into the desert, crashed, and either died of exposure or wandered off into terrain that has never given him back. The support for this reading is substantial, and it's why police leaned toward no foul play. There is the strange behavior described by multiple people in the days beforehand: the abrupt haircut, the talk of miracles, the fixation on the woman he'd met, and the shift in his demeanor after that relationship soured, the unsettling Google searches, the co-worker's account of a distant, disconnected Daniel on that final morning, asking odd questions, staring into the desert, then turning right at the fork toward the wilderness instead of left toward home. And then the physical scene itself, a crash, and clothing removed and laid nearby. That last detail feeds one of the more disturbing possibilities within this theory. In cases of severe heat stroke, victims sometimes experience what's known as paradoxical undressing, a phenomenon in which a person in the final stages of hyperthermia, their body's temperature regulation collapsing, feels a sudden overwhelming heat and begins removing their clothing, even as they're dying. The family's own private investigator would later raise a version of this, suggesting the removed clothing might point to a medical crisis behind the wheel. In this framing, Daniel crashed, climbed out disoriented and overheating, shed his clothes, and walked off into a desert so vast and so unforgiving that a body could vanish into it completely, scattered by scavengers, buried by monsoon runoff, reduced to fragments that a search of even 70 square miles could easily miss. That's the first theory, and on its face, it accounts for a lot. But there's a serious problem with it, and the family has never stopped pointing at it. If Daniel died of exposure near that ravine, where is he? The rancher believed his cattle would have found a body. Cadaver dogs, drones, and hundreds of searchers combed that ground for years and recovered other human remains, but never Daniel's. And it doesn't touch the vehicle data at all. Does that gap change your thinking? Tell me in the comments which direction you're leaning, the desert or something darker. Because the second theory holds that Daniel Robinson was the victim of foul play, and that the crash scene was staged to conceal it. This is the theory his father believes, and it rests largely on the findings of Jeff McGrath, a retired police officer and accident reconstructionist from a firm called 3 Laws Recon, whom the family hired the very day the Jeep was recovered. McGrath examined the Jeep's airbag control module, the vehicle's so-called black box, and came away with data he found deeply alarming. According to his analysis, after the airbags deployed, the Jeep was driven approximately 11 additional miles. The ignition, he found, had been cycled dozens of times after the crash sequence. And on the blue-gray body of the Jeep, he identified red paint transfer, paint from another vehicle, which suggested a collision with something before the Jeep ever came to rest in that ravine. To McGrath and to David, the picture that emerged was of a scene that had been arranged. A car that had crashed somewhere, been driven further, and been positioned in a remote gully with Daniel's belongings laid out around it. Add the disturbed apartment, the computer accessed after the disappearance, and the rancher's insistence that the Jeep had appeared only in mid-July, and the family saw not a tragic accident, but a crime, deliberately dressed to look like one. There is also the detail that David returns to constantly. Every airbag in the Jeep deployed, not just the front, but the side and passenger airbags as well. To him, that raised the possibility that someone had been sitting in the passenger seat. Years later, he was still fighting to have the airbags and the clothing forensically tested, still asking whether Daniel had even been the one driving. Buckeye Police confirmed that all the airbags did deploy, but stated they had found no evidence to confirm a passenger was present. And this is where the theory meets its own hard counterweight, because Buckeye Police did not simply dismiss McGrath's work. They hired their own accident reconstructionist to examine the same evidence. That expert produced a 15-page report and reached a very different conclusion. The report acknowledged an anomaly. It found the ignition had been cycled roughly 44 times after the crash, and openly described that as an unanswered anomaly, a genuine loose end. But on the central question, it was direct. There is insufficient evidence to scientifically connect the Jeep to another crash, or support a theory the Jeep crash, as found, was staged. Its finding was blunt. The driver of the Jeep drove it into the ravine, and having rolled and unable to proceed further, abandoned the Jeep as it lay. Police also offered alternative, non-sinister explanations for the mileage discrepancy between the odometer and the airbag data, explanations that would not require anyone to have driven the vehicle after the crash, and which they noted Jeep dealerships had observed in other vehicles. As for the red paint, police acknowledged there had been at least one crash in the Jeep's history, but said it wasn't clear when the paint had been transferred. It may have had nothing to do with June 23rd at all. The foul play theory carried one more complication, and it's a painful one. David and his private investigator eventually parted ways, and the split was over interpretation. McGrath had come to favor a medical explanation, at one point publicly floating a theory involving PCP intoxication that could explain both erratic behavior and the removed clothing. David found that theory impossible to believe and unacceptable to attach to his son. The two men disagreed sharply, and McGrath no longer works for the family. It's a reminder of how thin the ground is here. Even the two investigators most committed to solving this case could not agree on what their own evidence meant. The third theory is the most speculative, and it deserves to be labeled exactly that. Some have suggested that Daniel, working alone in remote desert terrain, known to see illegal activity, may have crossed paths with something dangerous, drug trafficking, or smuggling operations of the kind that move through Arizona's empty spaces. It's a possibility rooted more in the geography than in any specific evidence tied to Daniel's case, and no investigator has produced facts connecting his disappearance to any such activity. It floats out there as a what-if, the way it always does in cases set in isolated country. But it is worth naming, if only to set it in its place, a speculation, not a finding. What unites all three theories is the same void at the center of this case. There is no body. There is no confirmed crime. There is no scenario that explains every piece of evidence without leaving something dangling. The desert theory can't explain the vehicle data or produce a body. The foul play theory runs into a reconstruction report that found no proof of staging, and the desert crime theory has no direct evidence at all. 4 years of searching, and the most honest thing anyone can say is that Daniel Robinson drove into that desert on the morning of June 23, 2021, and the trail simply stops. This trail has been cold for 4 years now. 4 years of searches, 4 years of a father crossing the country again and again, 4 years of a family marking birthdays and holidays around an empty chair. But here is the thing about cold cases: they get solved. Every single year, cases that sat silent for decades crack open because of new DNA technology, a deathbed confession, a single tip from a person who finally decided to speak. If you've ever followed a case that was cold for years and then broke wide open, tell me about it in the comments. Those stories matter here. They are the reason families like Daniel's keep getting up in the morning. Because if there is one force that has kept this trail from disappearing entirely, it is David Robinson II. A retired U.S. Army veteran who served 2 tours in Afghanistan, David turned the search for his son into something that has redefined the case, and in many ways, his own life. He has organized dozens of searches through the Buckeye Desert. By 2025, more than 50 of them. In the early days, he searched for a living son he prayed had somehow survived. In more recent years, he has spoken with heartbreaking clarity about what those searches have become. "We're not looking for Daniel out here running around," he said at one search. "We are looking for remains. Those volunteer searches have turned up other human remains over the years. Remains that, in every confirmed instance, belong to someone other than Daniel." Buckeye police have confirmed that 2 sets of human remains were recovered during the search efforts, and that neither was Daniel. The family maintains that their own searches have recovered the remains of even more missing people, a grim testament to how many others have vanished into that same desert, and to how much ground David and his volunteers have covered. The case has drawn national attention. Daniel's parents appeared on the Facebook Watch series Red Table Talk to speak about his disappearance and their fight with investigators. His story has been covered by NPR, CNN, Fox, and the Dateline podcast Missing in America. In April 2025, when David held one of his largest searches, he was joined in the Arizona desert by Joe Petito, the father of Gabby Petito, who has devoted himself to helping other families of the missing find attention and answers. "It's the worst, uncontrollable feeling you can imagine," Petito said that day. "That's why we are out here today, to try and get answers for David and Daniel." David's grief has also become advocacy on a national scale. Drawing on everything he learned navigating his son's case, the telecommunications gaps, the legislative shortfalls, the reasons families so often can't find their loved ones quickly, he ran for U.S. Congress in 2024 and has said he intends to run again in 2026, carrying with him the more than 600,000 Americans reported missing each year. He built a website, launched petitions, raised hundreds of thousands of dollars through a GoFundMe to fund the search, and put Daniel's face on a billboard along an Arizona interstate. As for the official investigation, it remains open and active. The FBI has been briefed on the case twice. Detectives investigated a reported sighting of Daniel in the Hassayampa River bottom on the day he disappeared, but found that the digital evidence from his vehicle and devices didn't align with that account. By 2025, there was a new detective and a new police chief in Buckeye, something David described as feeling like a reset, a fresh set of eyes on evidence he has spent years begging to have tested. He continues to push for forensic testing of the airbags, the clothing, and the vehicle itself, still chasing the question of whether his son was even the one behind the wheel. Buckeye Police have held their line and their commitment in the same breath. Buckeye Police are committed to locating Daniel Robinson and getting answers for his loved ones, the department stated on the 4th anniversary of his disappearance. This missing person case remains open until we find Daniel. And David Robinson, 4 years and thousands of miles into a search that has consumed his life, still refuses to close the door on hope. "I'm always going to believe that my son is alive and well," he said. "I'm going to find him. It's only a matter of time." He described the vision that keeps him moving. "I look at every day, hoping and praying that a miracle happens, and he comes knocking on my door, ringing the doorbell and saying, 'Dad, I'm home.' I would love that. That would be the best thing to ever happen. If you know anything about the disappearance of Daniel Robinson, anything at all, no matter how small, no matter how many years have passed, the Buckeye Police Department tip line is 6411. A detail you've dismissed as unimportant, a memory from that stretch of Sun Valley Parkway, something you saw in that desert in the summer of 2021. It could be the piece that finally brings this trail in from the cold. Daniel Cornelius Robinson was a geologist who loved rock formations enough to call his father just to describe them. He was a young man born without a right hand, who never once let it define him, who made friends easily, who chased adventure across a landscape he found beautiful, and who always called home. He was 24 years old. He had a hiking trip planned with his sister. He was, by every account of the people who loved him, extraordinary. Somewhere in America, this trail is still cold, but someone out there remembers something. If that someone is you, make the call.